Um, and so the question, I guess, I'm asking, I think you're asking the same question, is do we need the high-end violent conflict to create these leaders,
Right.
uh, or at least in large enough number, or is there a way to organically grow them a different way? I think if your life is too comfortable, you have little incentive to achieve. And this is my fear with AI in education. If I'm a student and I can play a video game all day and then have AI write my paper, uh, what's my incentive to go through the hard work of learning how to write? What's my incentive of
Right.
going through the hard work of learning how to do research? Especially if I'm thinking, when I'm an adult, I'll just have AI do my work too. I need to write, I need to do a research project for the business I'm working for. I'll just have AI do it. And I think as long as there's this ability to go to the easy mechanism, people don't develop the skills that are required to do the hard work.
Welcome to Parallax, the resurrection of truth, beauty, and goodness. Parallax, a media war engine. Parallax, the construction amidst eternal decay. Parallax, the portal to the edge of chaos. Parallax, poem and provocation. Parallax, mad philosophers and tantric demigods. Parallax, totem for an unknown god. Parallax, philosophy and the return of the matriarch. Parallax, the end of the meaning crisis. Parallax, the whispering daemon in your ear. Parallax, the god of wisdom, wine and love. Parallax, your home for superior publications, podcasts and courses. Parallax, join us today. Parallax.
Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Parallax podcast. My name is Tom Mark. With me today is Professor Roy Casagrande, Professor for Government and Political Science. Welcome, sir, to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
I would like to talk with you about war. It seems, looking back at our history, war seems to be an integral part of war. And yet it's very hard to define what war really is. And I wanted to talk with you about what is really war and what are the aspects and characteristics of war. So just to start us off, like, what is the right way to talk about war and to frame war?
Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously, you're going to get a little bit of disagreement on what exactly a war is. The conventional sort of simplistic definition of war is when two state actors, or doesn't have to necessarily be two state actors, but usually it is, are intentionally targeting military assets. So, if I have a division and it's fighting another a division on the other side, I'm attacking a military asset. Of course, that gets really messy when the military assets are inside a city, for example, and then you're in the process also attacking civilian infrastructure or civilians. So the sort of the conventional wisdom is terrorism is when you're intentionally attacking civilians, and then warfare is when you're intentionally attacking military assets. In World War II, just to make it nice and messy, the United States bombed the living hell out of Europe with a little bit of help from the British, and the bombs had an accuracy rate of about 1%. So if you were trying to target a military factory and you wanted to hit it with 10 bombs, you had to drop 1,000 bombs to get 10 bombs to hit that. Well, the other 990 bombs are going to land in people's homes and bakeries and schools. And so then, is that an act of war or is that an act of terrorism? And I think that's where there's a little bit of blurriness. But for that matter, what if I sanction your economy and I don't shoot a bomb or shoot a bullet at you? Is that an act of war if I'm undermining your economy? I think there's sort of this sort of gray space where war might not even necessarily be an act of violence. Um, but for the most part, I think we think of it as that.
Yeah, I mean, there is, of course, the classical definition of von Clausewitz, of course, that everybody knows, that war is the continuation of policy through other means. And
Yeah,
then, I don't know if you know the book Human Smoke by Nicholas Baker. And so
I don't know.
so that's a book that highlights the development towards World War II through documents and through letters and recorded speeches, and highlighted how, you know, from 1932 to 1942, kind of a whole society moved into the state of war. And it's very hard to say, like, where did it actually begin? It's a famous book, Nicholas Baker. So, but you say it's about the exchange of, you know, military means, let's say, and the targeting of certain facilities, right?
I mean, I think that's sort of the simplistic general understanding, is that war is between militaries. But the reality is that's not possible, because at the end of the day, the war is going to take place in spaces where civilians own the property, or there's civilian infrastructure, or there are just civilians in that space. So war is much more than that. It becomes this messy, there's never been a war in human history where an invaded population didn't experience rape on a large scale. So rape is an inherent and integral part of war. Every single army in human history has raped. There's
Right.
with zero exceptions. It's not even possible. So once you start to peel back the onion of what warfare is, you start to realize that it's more to that. When you did the von Clausewitz definition, the other one I think that's interesting is Sun Tzu's idea that peace exists only to prepare for the next war.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah, right. And so the two of them have very similar definitions. They're just sort of approaching it a little bit differently. Um, so I guess the question then is war the result of the failure of diplomacy, or is diplomacy the ability to create the situation where the war will happen at your choosing when you finally do get to that space? Um,
Right.
right, yeah,
Yeah, so what you're alluding to is also kind of that war. I mean, as far as I, as a layman, understand it, it's a kind of state that two actors or even one actor, it's kind of a civil war, can engage in, and society acts by different rules if it's in a state of war, right?
yeah,
But also we can't really separate the phenomenon and the state of war from states of peace, and the result a war has on a peaceful society, like later in time, or as a result of peacetime. So the effects of war kind of um, are to be found like in the years to come after the war just ended. And so where does what is, I'm still struggling to find the right way of finding the boundaries and the effects of war, because they have to be
yeah,
included in some form. Because if you look at, for example, the Second World War, the old Frankfurt School of philosophy wouldn't have been possible without that event. And so it it radiates into the whole society, and it
yeah.
seems to play a crucial part on the development of society. And so so what is the function of war then?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. When the war ends, there is the trauma that was created during the war, the broken infrastructure, the broken bodies, the lost lives, the guilt, the shame. I mean, Germans are still carrying so much guilt and
Right.
shame from World War II. That it's like woven. I'm part German, so it's woven into our DNA at some level, just because it's this heavy burden to carry. Um, so yeah, it's not clean. Also, Germany surrenders May 7, 1945, but there were guerrilla units that actually tried to sustain the war, and were trying to fight even afterwards. You know, so even then, it got messy. World War One, the Freikorps was in the east, still trying to fight the war, even though Germany had surrendered, and the British had to go in there and disarm them. And
Right.
the tragedy of that, of course, is a lot of those soldiers ended up joining these extreme far right organizations. Um, and then you mentioned the Frankfurt School in the aftermath of World War One, trying to figure out what's the space that we're going to operate in. And then of course in World War Two they get scattered to the wind because so many of them are persecuted. Um, so you were saying it's hard to figure out when World War Two exactly starts. that's that's a great point. In my mind, of course, the simple way to think of it is it starts on July 7, 1937, when Japan attacks China. But the reality is you could say, well, maybe it started with the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, or maybe it started with the election of Hitler. Like, where does the boundary really land? And because a war doesn't just happen, there were events that brought you to that moment. The 30 Years' War is a fun example of this. It's really a bunch of wars that a historian went, these wars are all related to each other. I'm just going to call it one war and call it the 30 Years' War. But, most historians think the 30 Years' War lasted about 50 years. and,
Yeah, yeah.
and so then you're like, what a terrible name. The 7 Years' War is another classic example of that. It starts in 1754 and ends in 1763. It's really hard to subtract 54 from 63 and land with the number 7. I usually get 9 when I do that. And so you realize right away that whoever named it that was clearly thinking about it in a different way than we think about it today. And so that there's a subjectivity to how we frame wars. At one point there was a professor that I had that would say, World War I and World War II are the same war, they just took a break in the middle. I think that's an oversimplification, but it's interesting in the way because it imperialism is at the heart of why World War I happens and why World War II happens. So in a way, there is this interesting linkage.
Right.
Yeah. And then, of course, you get the situation where you have a society that has a war mindset, and that can be because of the politics that's leading up to a war, or it could be like rhetoric. LBJ said, we're going to do a war on poverty. And the image I have in my mind is that you're just walking around shooting homeless people and beggars. That's not what he meant, obviously. His imagery was that we were going to end poverty and we were going to give people wealth and raise them up. But why use the rhetoric of war? Why not use,
Right.
you know,
Exactly.
and so it's really interesting when you start to see that there's sort of this we're at war with drugs, the war on drugs, or whatever rhetoric that gets used. Also, I think changes the way people think about the world. And one of the problems that we have is our lens frequently is there are these categories and they're black and white, and there's bad and there's good, and there's less room for gray. And then we think of it, oh, I have to win, as opposed to I have to compromise, I have to find some middle ground. And so we'll take the warrior mentality into the wrong situation frequently too.
Right. So I don't know. It's a concept that comes from medicine, and in preparation of these podcasts, I was thinking about this a lot. So you have this concept of salutogenesis, and it looks, I don't know if you're familiar with it. So you don't look at the health of the body just in dual terms, but you look at it as a spectrum. Salutogenesis is like you're always in between absolute health and absolute sickness, somewhere in between. And so there are days that your body is better, and the other days it's worse, but you're never really completely sick and you're never really completely healthy. And so I was
Yeah,
wondering, yeah, in terms of war, it's like in a way it seems we are in a constant state of what I call bellumgenesis. We're like constantly in between war and in between peace, and one melts and goes
yeah,
into the other. It's kind of a flowing movement, because I mean we're talking about the Cold War for ages now. Now we're like in a
right.
phase where that heats up. Is that a war? Wasn't that a war? Have we been really at peace for the last 70 years or 80 years? Or you get what I'm saying? It's just
Oh, absolutely.
it's a flowing movement. And so to think not as war and peace like two separate states a society can engage in, but it's more like a fluidum, like a dance, and the problem with this is, of course, that we don't know which of our behaviors can escalate war and which of our current behaviors can escalate peace, right? And so that's always the conundrum that we're facing ourselves in.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Okay, so this makes me think of when I was a kid. I was ninth grade, I think it was. Uh, there was a test, and the question was the 19th century a period of peace or war? And I wrote war. and I got it wrong. And the reason was the teacher said, yeah, but there weren't that many wars in Europe after Napoleon. Like it was meant to be between Napoleon and World War One. And I was, in my mind, it was a period of enormous war because Europe was invading the planet and conquering Africa and Asia. And so what I had to do was I had to go, oh, she meant for white people murdering white people in between Napoleon and World War One. She didn't
Right.
think it mattered that white people were murdering brown and black people. That wasn't war. That was the white man's burden or something, right? So I think there's also a little bit of that kind of imperialistic, where you can feel like you're in a state of peace, or you can at least imagine England in the countryside in a Jane Austen novel, where there's a sense of peace because you've divorced yourself from the soldiers who are fighting to conquer this African state or that Asian place. And and I think that's in a way what happened with the Cold War was it was sort of a return to that kind of imperialism, except that instead of it being instead of it being the UK and France, it was the United States and the Soviet Union. And the proxy wars that were fought, like in Vietnam or in Korea or in Angola or in Ethiopia, these nasty conflicts happened in the Cold War, which turned out, if you were living in one of those countries, wasn't really cold. It was extremely hot. But in the United States and in Europe, it was cold. And, it was dangerous, but it was cold. But, there was a wall in Berlin and people were dying, but it wasn't the kind of conflict that we're seeing, like, for example, uh, in Ukraine and Russia or the Middle East right now. And so at some level, I think we also have this tendency to divorce ourselves from where the conflict is taking place if it's not in our immediate zone of vision, like if it's not directly affecting us.
Right. And so when we're looking back in our history, it seems that war is an integral part. Just not judgingly, just it is. When we look at
It
history,
is.
it is a history of war, basically. So, but
Yes.
what is the function of war in context of the, let's say it, bluntly, in terms of the development of society, or the shifting of worldviews of society? It's like, what is the function of war? What is the right way to understand our propensity and our tendency to wage war?
Yeah. So that's a great question. Yesterday I was talking to a friend and I said to her, I probably said this in other places. I know I've said this in other places. I don't know if it's ever been recorded, so it might be the first time that war or that history is just a series of violent events strung together with a good story.
Right.
And so when you think about it, when you start talking about history as a general rule, you're just bouncing from war event to war event to war event. Um, at the end of the day, we're tribal, right? Our species is very tribal, to the point, in my mind, that it's ad nauseum. Like I despise nationalism. I think it's a foolish notion that one nation is somehow better than another nation. I think we're all equally worthless. Um, and as soon as you embrace the worthlessness of us, then you can have a happy and joyous life. But at the end of the day, we are tribal, and we want to link up into these communities, and communities are necessary for our species' survival. So it's not wrong for us to want to be part of a community. What's interesting to me is that once we're in that mindset, war becomes very easy for us. So when World War One broke out, there were people on the left who were actually quite excited about it because they thought what would happen was the working class soldiers from the factories would show up on the front lines, and the French soldier would be looking at the German soldier and they would think, that guy's just another fellow factory worker. And instead of shooting each other, they would turn on their officers, murder their officers, and then head back to Paris and Berlin and do a socialist revolution. And of course, that's exactly not what happened. They ended up murdering each other wholesale. Because at the end of the day, I think that tribalism kicks in and we become blinded by it. And we can't even see clearly enough to recognize the sameness in the other side, the sameness in the other person. If you lined up a group of French soldiers and German soldiers out of uniform, nobody would be able to tell them apart. Like it's a miracle they knew who to shoot. Um, so this tribalism, I think, it can have a wonderful side to it because it creates this kind of competitive nature. But then the dark side is that at some point that competitive nature sort of breaks down and turns to violence. It's one thing for me to try to beat the other guy just because I'm trying to be better than him. It's another thing because I'm trying for me to just want to kill him and steal his resources or whatever my end goal in killing him is. And so our species is bad at creating balance. At some point, we will reach that threshold point where, nah, we're just going to have to kill each other. In a way, the classic example is the trigger that causes World War One. The British Empire and the French Empire had carved up so much of Africa and Asia that by the time Germany was born in 1871, Germany had no way to catch up other than to defeat France or Britain and take their colonies. And, the British made some attempts to, you can have Tanganyika and we'll take Kenya and Zanzibar, and you can have Togoland and Sud-West Africa and the Bismarck Archipelago. Wouldn't that be great? And we'll give Congo to Belgium so you don't get it. And we'll make sure that the United States gets Hawaii so that you don't get it. That was kind of the mentality. And in the end, Germany found that unsatisfactory and began building a massive navy. The Navy threatened the British, so the British felt they had to have a war to sink the German Navy before it became a real threat. And so World War One was built into that imperialist conflict, and all you could have ever done was postpone it. It was inevitable. It had to happen as long as capitalistic imperialism was the rule of the day, because the German state wasn't going to accept second place. It wanted to be first. And why not? Why should the British be first? You know what I mean? Like they're not superior. They just got to the game faster. And so I think that's the inherent problem when you have this sort of zero-sum game. If they have it, I don't.
So, but you're also alluding that certain macro movements and of society are maybe enhanced or instigated by war. I mean, could we have been? I formulated bluntly. Could we have been a global society, a global pluralistic society that we are more or less are now, interconnected with the web and with the technologies, and with, at least in the in the West, this kind of pluralistic mindset? Could that have been possible without World War One and Two? So
yeah, why not? You would have had to reject imperialism and capitalism, but if you did, so right, at the end of the day, capitalism has this sense of zero-sum game. If you have $10, I don't have that $10. So the only thing I can do if I want to expand my wealth is take your $10 from you. But that's not how the economy works. The way the economy works is if you have $10, you're going to spend it, and you might spend it on a product I'm producing. So I might get the benefit of that, and then I'll take that $10 and I'll spend it in my company, or I'll spend it personally, and that fuels the economy. And if you do enough of this, at some point, the wealth of the economy expands. But in capitalism, the rich take that wealth and then they hoard it. They don't spend it. They put it in banks, or they put it in assets, and they just lock it into the ground. They're like maniac squirrels putting acorns into hollow trees. The acorns are just going to rot over time. They're not going to turn into trees. And so the acorns have been taken out of the system, so to speak. And I think that's unfortunately sort of the driving mindset that fuels our economy. As long as that's the driving mindset, there will always be conflict, because at some point there's going to be a population of people who are going to feel like they're not getting their fair share. And they will either go into a state of rebellion and trigger a civil war, or it's a state that thinks, oh, the other state's vulnerable. Now's my chance to take advantage and, invade them or take some assets from them by force. And so, worse yet, your economic model is based on that. For example, the United States, for all the trappings of French and British imperialism. The United States is just as imperialistic. It's just it doesn't plant the flag and annex this, the land into its empire. It overthrows the democracy it didn't like the government for, and then steals the resources and brings in its corporations. So it's a new style of imperialism, but unfortunately, it's frequently violent. I mean, just ask Iraqis and Vietnamese how they feel about it, and you know.
Right. Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
cruel,
I'm
but
just,
there's no reason to anymore. You're right.
yeah.
I think we're past that. We should be anyway.
I'm just wondering, we all like the story, and I say this consciously. We like the story of societal progress from ancient times. We like the story that we came up, we Western with Enlightenment, suddenly, what we call modernity, and out of that developed postmodernity, and before that was kind of the religious pre-modern times, and before that, and so we like that story, right?
Yeah.
And I think Wengrow uh, wrote a book about how that story kind of failed, and you had a beautiful lecture on modernity and how that story doesn't really work that way because we had different setups of modernity. But again, within that story of if we indulge in that story for a second, so the question still lingers if that story would have been possible without war, and how much war enabled that story to emerge and play out in the kind of sense. Or
Yeah.
is war
So,
just a different phenomenon altogether?
no, I totally think war is part of how Europe, at least, and certainly the United States as well, have created the kind of prosperity that they have. And there are obviously multiple, well, it wasn't exactly the same way in each place, but when you think about what the United States is, um, a little bit over 400 years ago, English colonists arrive in what will become the Virginia colony at Jamestown, and they stole the land from the Native American population. They waged wars against the Native Americans and took the land from them. That's just the instant creation of wealth. That land was more valuable than any product that was being produced on it at that time. Like if they had stole the corn out of the fields, it wouldn't have the value. If they had stole the tobacco, the land was what they were there for. And then they waged a sort of war by enslaving Africans and bringing them over. By the way, the United States, well, the British also enslaved Native Americans. Um, they realized it was hard to keep Native American slaves in the colonies, so they began exporting them. They sent some of those Native Americans to Europe for slavery, and some of those Native Americans ended up in Bermuda or in the Caribbean. And then African slaves were brought to the colonies. So you're stealing their labor. And that's an extremely violent event, right? Because you're capturing that person, you're putting them on the ship, you're bringing them to this new place, and then you're, through violence, forcing them to provide their labor for free. And so, at its very birth, the act of creating what became the United States was an extremely violent wealth transfer event where a bunch of poor English people could come over and suddenly become wealthy um, at the expense of others. And of course, that's the whole role of imperialism. So when I think of England, I think of a place that's really nice. It's pretty, it's developed. There's London, there are these quaint towns, you know what I mean? Like I can't, there's obviously crime and rundown areas as well. But at the end of the day, you think of it as this Western enlightened place. That didn't just happen. That happened at the expense of the empire that it created. They happened at the expense of the Indians and the Egyptians and the South Africans and everybody else that they conquered. To give you a sense of this, when the British began conquering India, the Indian economy accounted for about 25% of the world's GDP. When India got its independence right after World War II, India was about 4% of the world's GDP. Well, how did that happen? And the answer is that the English literally transferred India's GDP to England. And then India got its independence, but the British made no attempt to go, oh, we stole all this wealth from you. Here, let's give it back. The attitude was, you should be grateful we're letting you go. as opposed to, we really owe you, we screwed you up so badly. And you'll hear the argument, well, but the English built railroad tracks. Yes, to pull the resources out of India. They didn't build the railroad tracks because they were being kind to the Indians. They were just taking the stuff to the ports so they could haul it out of there. And so at the end of the day, there was nothing that the English did in India. Like, one of the things that happened was, right, the English were studying diseases. They weren't trying to cure the diseases to help the Indians. They were trying to come up with ways that they could keep their soldiers in India and keep them healthy enough that they could commit the violence that was necessary to maintain the empire. They weren't doing this because they were, oh, Indians are dying of diseases, let's fix it. And so Europe benefited tremendously from this, even the parts of Europe that didn't necessarily do that kind of imperialism, because as England's economy grew, it traded with its neighbors, and then its neighbors would benefit indirectly from Indian colonization. And so the wealth of Western Europe and Central Europe, for that matter, really is built on the blood of capitalism and imperialism. Also, locally, the exploitation of labor locally. But to do the imperialism required violence. It required warfare. Very seldom did a population of people go, you know what? Okay, we surrender. Please don't shoot us.
Right.
It did
And to
happen
another
on occasion.
in another video, you mentioned again, that we're experiencing not like a first modernity, that appeared out of nowhere 250 years ago, but that there was a wealth transfer that happened because of the Crusades and the Mongols invading Baghdad, and bring the Crusaders bring all the technologies to Europe in agriculture and all of this. And so could you elaborate on this a little bit, like what you understand with under the term modernity in itself? Is that an episteme or an epoch, or is that a certain state? And how did warfare enable this wealth transfer from the East basically to the West?
Yeah, okay. So the way I've been looking at modernity is that what is it that makes a society modern? And I've kind of concluded that it's where you've developed enough convenience that you can take a relatively large segment of your population out of mundane labor so that they can do innovative labor, so that they can do things like work on mathematics, work on science, work on philosophy. So to get to that point, you have to have a significant development of your economy. By that definition, I probably haven't figured out all the places on the planet yet that had these conditions, but I can name 3 periods of time where they had it. Egypt during the 18th dynasty, which is about 3,500 years ago. You could write a list, and a guy would come pick up the list, and he would take it to the different stalls in the marketplace and buy your groceries for you and bring it to your home. You could have a guy come to your house and he'd pick up your laundry, and they would go do your laundry and then bring it to your home. So there was the kind of conveniences that we think of today as being so modern existed 3,500 years ago. And then the second modernity probably kicked off about 2,600 years ago and ended roughly somewhere around 391 AD with the burning of the Great Library. And then the third modernity was the Islamic Golden Age, which was a period of extreme advancement. During the Islamic Golden Age, modern agriculture was created, modern medicine was created. Ibn al-Haytham not only created the scientific method, he figured out that light had a finite speed, that all objects in the universe exert gravity. So, there were these huge leaps forward that took place during the Islamic Golden Age. In the middle of the Islamic Golden Age, the Crusades happened. And the Crusades lasted 195 years. And during that time, I'm going to invoke Hegel. So, Hegel has the thesis and the antithesis, and there's this clash between the two, and it creates a synthesis. And during that time, the Crusaders became that synthesis. They became very much Middle Easterners. They had learned so much of the technology that existed at the time in the place. And so when they returned to Europe, they brought that technology with them. And by the way, it changed the fashions. Like women began covering their hair just in Europe. Because they brought more than just technology with them. And in the process, it did alter Europe to a degree. I mean, obviously, it wasn't the kind of game changer event that would happen later on with imperialism, but it certainly kicked off what we think of as the period of time called the Renaissance. The Crusades end in 1291 with the fall of the city of Acre. And the Renaissance starts in the year 1300. So there's literally a 9 year gap between the two events. That's not a coincidence. The Mongol invasions, of course, definitely help Europe take off because you know, the Mongols massacre a huge chunk of the Arab world's population, the Persian world as well, for that matter, and even Turks. The estimates are that during the Mongol rampage, because it really was a rampage, that around 30 million people died at a time when the planet's total population was, less than a billion people. 30 million people really matters. And then in the aftermath of the Mongol invasions, but also because of the Mongols, there was another bubonic plague outbreak in 1347, 1348. And the timing of it all was catastrophic for the Middle East. Estimates maybe that as many as 50-60% of the population in the Middle East died in 2 years. So you just kind of compare that to COVID, where what was it, 0.2% of the world's population died, and then 50 to 60% of the world's population dies. You just it changed our DNA, right? That we've recently done some amazing research where they looked at graves pre 1347 and then looked at graves shortly afterwards, and you can see the DNA change. And by the way, one of the things that was changed may have made us more susceptible to coronaviruses. So the bubonic plague outbreak may have actually made it so that COVID was worse. It just
Oh,
shows
wow.
how everything is interconnected and there's no escaping our past.
Right. Okay. So what, if I may ask, so what is your preferred story of history? Because as I mentioned again, I think one of the dominant stories is a linear progression of
Yeah,
cultural states. And so I wonder, I mean, this is obviously a story because we can't really know. But I mean, what you're kind of suggesting is similar to what we're talking about, like more of a circular or spiral
yeah,
transition into different states, and sometimes the conditions are right that a society can enter in a kind of modernistic kind of way of living, where the economics are right, where the scientific approach is there, where there are form of governmental forms that kind of resemble what we have. Is that kind of spiraling circular motion like something that you would think of history, or like in context of this linear progression that we learn in school basically?
yeah. I totally think it's more like a sine wave, and you want to be on the crest. You don't want to be in the trough. You want to be at the high point. Um, you you want to be on the going upside before you get to the crest, because at the crest you're coming already back down. And I kind of feel like there's so many things pointing to if my model of four modernities is right, we're in the fourth modernity. There's a lot of things pointing to this. We're on the other side of that crest and we're coming down, which is really disappointing to me because I feel like it's self-imposed. Like there's no reason on earth for us to be doing this. The move to the extreme far right that's taking place globally. It's not, I think there's been a lot of focus on the United States and Europe, but obviously it's also taking place in places like India as well. And Turkey obviously is now maybe having a revolution to push back against that. Brazil played with it with Bolsonaro. There's been this unfortunate movement to recreate 1933. And by the way, I don't like the year 1933. I don't think we should do it again. Just to be clear, I think this is a really big mistake.
So, but how do
It's
you explain a
unfortunate.
phenomenon like this? That there's a global cultural movement to the right, let's say,
Yeah,
that we peaked, that
yeah,
somebody said, we were like in a slumber for this last 70 years. That has ended now. The protectorate of the United States towards, Europe has ended with
yeah.
Vance, and so what is happening? So, and given the fact that we apparently like war, as tribal beings. So what does it mean? Like, what is the right way to think about this? What can we expect? What is an explanation for what is happening from your point of view?
So it's complicated because uh, there's an argument to be made that conflict and adversity can create innovation. There's an argument to be made that having a nice stable economy leads to innovation as well. In other words, there's no formula that you can pin down. Like when I was talking about the Islamic Golden Age, a part of that was enormous chaos. And two of the greatest philosophers from that time period, Ibn al-Haytham and Ibn Sina, had to live through that chaos, and they came through shining on the other side. But then you think of, like the types of innovations the United States was making in the 1960s and even early 1970s. You think, oh, but look at in this Cold War period where things were very stable in the United States, look at all the kind of technology that was being created. So I don't think there's necessarily a formula for how you create that type of innovation. I do think there are markers that you can definitely point to for what it starts to look like when it starts to come apart. And one of those markers is a rise of anti-intellectualism, this push towards simplistic answers. I'll give you a fun example. I think it's fun. Maybe people won't like it, but Ghazali was a philosopher who wrote a book called The Incoherence of the Philosophers. And the year in my head, but somebody should probably double check me, is 1099 when he wrote the book. And what he basically argued was that when you ask a question in philosophy, you get three answers. In other words, you don't get it. I'm sorry, not three answers. You get three questions. So you ask a question, you get, instead of getting an answer, you get three questions. So then now you have to try to answer the three questions, and you get three questions for each of them. And so all you ever get is more and more uncertainty. And I can't disagree with that. Like you think of some of the amazing stuff that's happened in science recently and how it never seems to end. Like, oh, well, if that's true, then we need to explore this new thing. So what he's not wrong in the sense that if your goal is certainty, then science and philosophy aren't where you want to go. And so he said we need to put a little bit more attention on religion for answers. There was a counter book written by a guy named Ibn al-Rushd, which was named The Incoherence of the Incoherent. And he basically said, you got to be kidding me. Look what we've gotten from science. Our lives are so improved. We should be embracing this. And what it feels like is we're in a state right now, at least in the United States, where Ghazali is winning, where the experts are being called idiots, and where these reliable news sources are being trashed, and where people are spending their time trying to figure out how to prove to themselves the earth is flat and that the government is ruled by lizard aliens who eat children. And so instead of people using the internet and what should be another golden age for information to learn more, they're spending their time tunneling into these conspiracy theories and losing themselves into it and trashing normal intellectual sources of information. Another thing that I think happens is affluenza, that the society gets to a certain wealth level, and instead of people using that convenience and that space to research, they use that space and time to entertain themselves. And there's no drive or push to kind of get to the next level. And I think that's definitely happened in the last 50 years. When you think of the technology that we have today, it's mostly communication technology. We have in the last 50 years, the speed of air travel has gone down, not up. Fuel economy for cars went down, not up, right? We've gone the wrong direction on cars. If you look at all the technological leaps, we didn't settle the moon, we didn't go to Mars, right? The things that we thought we were going to do 50 years ago, flying cars, none of that's happened. But I have an amazing handheld computer, and I can talk to the world with it. And at some level, I almost feel like the capitalist economy went for the easy fruit, the low-hanging fruit. Where can I make my most money instead of doing the really difficult, interesting things? Instead of trying to cure cancer, it became how to manage cancer. And I think that slide towards how can I get rich? How can I live this easy life instead of how can I challenge myself is another indicator that we're on that downward slide. And strangely enough, there are parts of the world that have kind of caught on, and their attitude is, how do we fill the gap? China, for example, is definitely that one of those places. UAE has that attitude, like we'll do the innovating. You don't want to do it? Fine. They have a rocket program in UAE. UAE is number 5 for AI development. You think about it, they're competing with the big boys. They're competing with the United States and China at that point, right? Number 1 and number 2. How is UAE with its 11 million population actually seriously competing? And it's because there are places that have realized they're behind the curve. They have to catch up, and they want to. They can feel it. They haven't gotten caught into this comfortable life cycle.
Yeah, well, there's, I think we're not the first to mention, the connection between war, to come and vital and creative energy. I mean, this is historically, you can show this very easy. Like even in America, when they did the moon landing, I mean, we have this fairy tale flower power idea of America in the 60s, but I mean, they came just out of the Korea War. They went into the Vietnam War. They had lots of riots and civil unrest, and it was not
Yeah.
this flower power was just a tiny bubble that didn't reflect the turmoil of that country at that time, like properly. And so out of that came
Absolutely.
all these kind of things. The Renaissance, extremely violent times, brought forth artists that we
Yeah.
still admire. And so the question is, now we're living in this time of comfort, and where is the big art? Where is the new grand music and the new novel, or the inspiring piece of art? And so there is an argument to be made that there is a release of energy uh, sometimes needed in society that will find its way maybe into war, into societal shifts, but also into art. And I don't really know what to make of this perspective, or even if that's of this kind of perspective. Do we need this release of energy after the crest, after the wave comes down? And are we subjected to these kinds of ebb and flows of creative libido, basically?
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, I think there's a lot of evidence that suggests that something like that is part of our experience. Like maybe the human condition really is that we're on the sine wave. We'll never get off of it. There's going to be the ups and downs, and we're going to do violent conflict from time to time. It's especially dangerous now because of the nuke, but in a way it's not because you can imagine if World War III did break out that at some point one side would start to lose and then they would say, look, we have enough nukes, we can really do a lot of hurt on the planet. Let's go negotiate. And it's very unlikely that actors will go, oh no, we were willing to risk the nukes. Uh, but then there's the other side where somebody might make a mistake or a miscalculation, and the next thing you know, things really do go sideways. So I think there's a lot more at stake now than there was in the past, and that's maybe why this period that we're in now is a little bit more alarming, especially when you have unhinged leaders, and it seems like we have multiple unhinged leaders across the planet right now, where their grasp on reality maybe isn't so great. And part of it might also just be an age thing, right? It seems like we have a few too many geriatrics in positions of really, really high power, and maybe we should start putting limits. Like
Yeah.
Germany has a limit on how old you can be in the Supreme Court. I don't know why we can't do that with presidents. It seems like a good idea to me, but
Yeah,
maybe I'll change my
I
mind as
mean,
I reach that limit.
No, like if we want to get political in terms of Germany, I just wonder like why the quality of statesmen just so declined, because we had,
Yeah,
in the 60s and 70s we had so many great statesmen, Schmidt and
Willy
Genscher, and
Brandt.
yeah, insanely good and stress tested individuals that
Yeah,
learned their craft over decades and were really statesmen. They knew because they came out of the war generation. They knew exactly what that meant.
yeah,
And now it's like it seems like everybody has forgotten what a devastating and horrific experience war is. It's like in Germany you hear everywhere the drums of war. It's like everywhere, and it's like, are you even aware of what you're talking about? And,
yeah.
and it's weird because everybody seems to have forgotten the lectures of World War II. And
I
it's
agree
and
with you.
it's and so the question is like, how do we deal with this inbuilt kind of tendency towards war? Is there even, maybe as a last question, do you think there can be a future without war?
So I don't see why we can't do that. I mean, one way to get rid of war would be to give every state a nuke, because at that point, there's no way you can win war. But here's the weird thing. Like, if you look at the United States since World War II, the United States has literally won two wars. It attacked Panama in 89 and it attacked Iraq in 91. And it won both of those wars. All the wars since, it's lost, and all the wars between World War II and 1989, it lost. It just war is not what it used to be. It's very difficult to win wars. If you look at, Somalia attacked Ethiopia in the 1970s, and not only did Somalia not win, Somalia imploded. It collapsed. Like, there's four different breakaway states where Somalia used to be. The reality is the Iran-Iraq war, that went nowhere. It was just 10 years of, was it even 10 years? 8 years, I think it was 8 years of murder, where somewhere between 1 to 2 million people needlessly died. And the reality is wars just aren't profitable, in the sense that the odds of you winning if you're the attacker isn't high. And so the fact that world leaders don't seem to be able to figure that out really kind of blows my mind. Um, it's like, just read a book. Do some research before you do your next war. Like, I think when the United States attacked Iraq in 2003, George Bush probably didn't know where it was. Um, and you think, how is it that we end up with such low caliber leaders? When I think of, the great leaders in the last 50, 60 years, they're all from the 50s and 60s. We don't seem to be producing them anymore. And one of the questions that's in my mind is, I can actually think of some really amazing leaders that exist right now. It's just they're very few. It's not like it was in the past. Um, and so the question, I guess, that I'm asking, and I think you're asking the same question, is, do we need the high-end violent conflict to create these leaders,
Right.
uh, or at least in large enough number, or is there a way to organically grow them a different way? I think if your life is too comfortable, you have little incentive to achieve. And this is my fear with AI in education. If I'm a student and I can play a video game all day and then have AI write my paper, uh, what's my incentive to go through the hard work of learning how to write? What's my incentive of going
Right.
through the hard work of learning how to do research? Especially if I'm thinking, when I'm an adult, I'll just have AI do my work too. I need to do a research project for the business I'm working for. I'll just have AI do it. And I think as long as there's this ability to go to the easy mechanism, people don't develop the skills that are required to do the hard work. And unfortunately, I think that's what's happened, not just to our leaders, but to whole segments of our society. Uh, and I think that's one of the reasons why we're in a situation where there are so many people who believe the earth is flat today. I just, I'm just really disappointed
Yeah.
with
I
that.
mean, it's like you everywhere you look, it's like, where's the modern day Led Zeppelin?
Yeah. Oh, come on, Rammstein. Rammstein.
I think that's it.
Oh, there's
Yes.
Tool. tool, 9-inch nails. Look, there's stuff. Although, aren't they getting old? They're all getting old, aren't they? I'm actually ruining my own argument, I think, right now because all the bands I've named are so old. Uh, there's something definitely amiss right now. One of the things that also I think is crazy is I hear people say, is a civil war possible in the United States? And I just can't wrap my mind around the fact that, you were saying Germany's beating the war drum. The United States is beating the Civil War drum.
Right.
Why? Why would anybody who had any knowledge of history think that a civil war was ever a good option? Uh, it's so nuts to think that this is, a path you want to take. I I challenge anybody who thinks the civil war is a good option to go live in Syria for a while and see what their 14 years of hell on earth has achieved for them, and all the time that they're going to be spending now working through the trauma of trying to put their state back together, if they even can, right? This new government is in its infancy. Who knows if it's going to pull this off or not? And who knows if we want them to, because we don't even really know if they're the good guys or not.
I mean,
It-
similar considerations are done in terms of the UK. If the UK is, on the verge of civil unrest, and the feeling that I have is, talking about modernity, and maybe that's a way to wrapping this all up. It's like, for me, the understanding of modernity is that we have like a common understanding of the reality that we're living in, and we can have different opinions.
yeah,
But we're kind of sharing a kind of the same world that we're living in, and that is completely gone now. So
that
you
is
have
gone.
you have the left team, you have the red team, the blue team, and they're literally living in different worlds.
Yeah,
That is how it looks to me. There's no common ground. It's every perspective, every narrative, every story, everything diverges, and it's like it's as if there are different worlds now. It's like what happened with postmodernity, the grand narrative, deconstructed, and they're now like this little micro narratives and micro bubbles, like Sloterdijk said. And so it's like these people are living in different worlds, and then that builds resentment, and
yeah.
the and so it's like, of course, civil war is an atrocious event, but if you're tackling it from that perspective, it's not something that is you know, out of the realm of possibility, you know?
Well, I mean, as a person who's spent a huge chunk of his life in Texas, Texas has been basically taken over by a Christian fundamentalist fascist government. And their goal is to superimpose their concept of reality on everybody. And that concept of reality is really divorced from reality. Like the earth is 5,000 years old and there's never been any evolution kind of reality. And you think, wait a minute, this is 2025. How did we get here? Why are we even having these conversations that were conversations we were having, 1,000 years ago in the middle of the Dark Ages? Like, you would think we had somehow gotten past that once we got to the moon, but apparently
Right.
not. And it feels like the pendulum is swinging in the exact wrong direction. The United States is becoming less and less egalitarian, less and less democratic. Uh, and the United States, unfortunately, sets the tone for so much of the world. Like, I have heard over and over again people go, well, if the United States is doing this, why can't we do it? And it's like, no, first of all, stop looking at the United States for your role model. They're very bad. And then second of all, just because somebody else is bad doesn't mean you should be bad.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
I feel like that's kind of, the pendulum is swinging in this really weird direction. And I agree with you. Like the fact that we can't agree to the basic facts, alternate facts. Right, during the first Trump administration, that was a term the administration kept throwing around. Like, we have an alternate reality that we were operating in, and it's like, no, that's not great. He wanted to inject sunlight and chlorine into people to kill COVID, and you're like, I don't see how you inject sunlight. That's not a thing.
Yeah.
Where's this coming from? And
There's this
chlorine is one of the
there's
nastiest
this
poisons on Earth.
there's this Italian philosopher and political scientist, Giorgio Agamben. I don't know if you have heard of him. And so he talks about the Civil War as being, a necessary state that a nation has to go through periodically. And so he talks about, about ancient Greece and, the Solonic law. Everybody had to participate in the, as you are like a citizen of the polis, you had to engage in civil war because the only goal of the civil war is to come back together. That was the goal. And but you had to go through these times. And I'm just wondering if in order we can come together, we need to go through this eternal conflict again and again and again, to find us again. It's like, you get what I'm saying? So maybe we are
Oh, I
subjected to these
do.
eternal cycles.
I think I would, in the case of the United States, I don't know if it works because when the Civil War ended, the South never surrendered. It surrendered militarily, but it never surrendered politically. And that's exactly where we are now, is the South has won. And so, after the Civil War ended, the slogan was the South will rise again, the lost cause, the great lost cause. And that's exactly what the Trump administration is. It's the South has risen and it has taken over and it has brought its
Well, yeah.
conservative, Christo-fascist ideals to the federal government. And so, so in that way, I think the first US Civil War failed to bring the polis back together. And I guess that's where I'm nervous about. So I believe in this cycle because I don't see how there's anything else. I just sometimes the cycle fails. And I think that's what causes states to really just ultimately collapse. And obviously Athens eventually does collapse, right? The Spartans eventually do collapse. And in a way, it was because of the decadence of the state. So Athens gets conquered by Sparta, and there's all these Spartans now in Athens, this rich city, and they became infected by that wealth, and they became lazy and lethargic. One of the reasons the Arab Empire collapsed was they stopped fighting their own wars and began hiring mercenaries to do it for them. And then eventually the mercenaries were like, dude, we're the only guys armed. Why are we listening to anybody else? Let's just take over. And so, there's this thing that keeps being repeated where people get caught up in the wealth of it and they forget the meaning of it. Money should not be your goal. Money should be a means towards creating your goal, towards creating your ends. And I think that's one thing that we, from time to time, lose perspective on.
Professor Casagrande, thank you so much for taking the time for this podcast. That was great. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. This is awesome.
Yeah, sure.